I'm Tabitha Scoville. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Historical Society, and I'd like to introduce Michael Brewster to you. I always want to say Brewer. He's a native of Syracuse, but he's lived here for the last 3 years. He's finished his master's degree in English this past May. He's been an avid history buff his whole life, and he's going to be talking about researching your ancestors using military tract information and such. So we hope you enjoyed the program. One other thing, if you didn't sign the logbook when you came in, please do that on the way out. We also have a raffle, and we have our 2017 calendar that are on special today, which is what our little menu is for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Hello, everyone. Even though I'm not a historian, my background in English has provided me with a really great, solid structure in research. And history is nothing but stories that we write down, that we tell. And so basically, as an English person, stories are what I live on. So I like to write and I like to read stories. And a couple years ago, I got interested in the story of the Sullivan expedition that came through central New York in 1779 during the Revolutionary War. So this was back in about 2010. So I spent a couple years reading about it as much as I could. And through the reading, I found many different versions of the stories available depending on who wrote the history and when it was written and from what perspective it's written. And so one of my ideas in both research and also in genealogy, as we'll get to, is what really happened. So I want to talk about how I figure out the ideas of what really happened, and hopefully maybe we'll come up with some pointers on how you can do that too when you're looking at your own genealogy. So we'll start off with what inspired me. Cornell professor Albright did a lot of research on the Sullivan expedition, and as a matter of fact, he probably is the foremost person that I've looked for inspiration and looking at his materials. He spent 40 years compiling a list based on this line. They were at a conference in 1929, which was the semi-centennial of the Sullivan expedition, and the question came up with, we wonder how many soldiers who were on this expedition settled in upstate New York and even through in Pennsylvania. So how many people went from the Pennsylvania march all the way up through to the top of the Finger Lakes, west to Geneseo, and then eventually settled that land. As you know, the country opened up after the war through a series of treaties with the Six Nations. New York State took over the land, and with the preemption from Massachusetts, bought the western New York section. And so this is a question that's an interesting question, but it took Albright 40 years to start to answer this. And as I was reading through his research, he has a list of about 6,000 men who actually went on the expedition. And I said, well, if I have a list of men who went on the expedition and I have the internet, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can find who did this. And quickly I realized that it's a very big research problem. All of the men, 6,000 men, to see if they settled. So I decided to limit my searching a little bit to something that I thought could be manageable. And so I started with a map. This is New York State in 1792. This is Simeon DeWitt's map, and a lot of the work was actually done by his relative Moses DeWitt, who was an on-the-ground surveyor. And Simeon DeWitt was the person who was a state surveyor, and he ended up living in or owning a lot of the area of Ithaca down at the bottom of the lake. He got some of that land down there. That's why DeWitt name is so big in Ithaca. But you can see here that on the eastern end you have the edge of, essentially the edge of what New York State was before the war. And as you come west, you start to see some of these new tracts that were developed through these counties, Otsego and what becomes Madison County and Chenango County. And this one is old enough, it still has the entire Oneida Reservation before it was parceled out and taken over. It has the Onondaga Reservation, including most of what's now the town of Onondaga and the city of Syracuse, going all the way around the edge of the lake there. And 1 mile away from the lake was what the Salt Reservation became. New York State owned that. The Cayuga Reservation at the top of Cayuga Lake, both ends. All those were somehow diminished. The only one that stands now with a little bit of this is still the Onondaga Reservation, and this is gone. The rest of that's been sold and taken over. And so we have here a series of land plannings. There's a lot of writing that you can read about how this was planned out, especially in the grid style. And it has influenced settlement patterns and the way we live today. So that if you drive through, especially in between the two lakes, in between Cayuga and Seneca Lake, you drive through some of those roads and they're exactly straight, 1 mile square. And it's really interesting to see today that this was laid out in the late 1790s. So our focus will be Cortland County, this small section down here in the corner of the larger tract. So if we isolate this and just show the Central New York military tract, it was originally planned to be 25 townships. And the word township is an interesting word for us. We'll talk about that in a second. And because of the way, especially down here at the bottom, some of this surveying was not correct, and there were lands that were actually claimed by Massachusetts down here that had to be reallocated, and so they added on places like Junius and Galen, and at the top Sterling, which is not even shown on this one, because that land right there would be plotted out as well. But this is basically when you hear about your Revolutionary War ancestor having been given a bounty in New York State, this is the land that was given. As it turns out, almost none of our ancestors settled in this area. The number is ridiculously low. If you think about every one of these lots having the chance of being given out to an individual soldier, there's something like 2,800 available, and they subtract 6 lots per township for public purposes, the churches and what they call literature, so schools. You end up reducing that number, and there's a lot of conflicting numbers available because people like captains got more land than people like privates. So the number wasn't exactly 2,500 people who got the patents, but there's around 1,800 soldiers who ended up with one of these pieces of land. So from the 6,000 people that went on the Sullivan expedition, I thought, okay, I have about 1,800 pieces of land to look at and to try to correlate those names. And so I started doing that a couple of years ago without even thinking twice about it. I knew it would take me a while, but I have the internet, and every once in a while I'll just go on and search some things and look for some places and find some people. Quickly I realized that almost nobody settled, which is a conundrum, I think, because it seems like we all feel like whenever I talk to people, they say, yeah, my ancestor got land, was given land in New York State because they served in the war, in the Revolutionary War. And so I'm thinking to myself, how is this popular conception so misguided? And so I started wondering about that and actually looking into it. And as it turns out, 100 years ago, or a little bit more than 100 years ago, a lot of histories were written about the beginnings of this area. So centennial, we'd say, or even not even centennial, but like a history of Cortland County from the 1850s or 1860s would talk about the fact that none of the settlers were actually people who received their patents. But somehow, since then, we've lost that knowledge. And there are current historians that talk about this entire area as having been a land grab against the Six Nations. And so I'm wondering, how do those current historians really rectify that with the actual evidence? And so that's where I like to do my research in those, and that perspective change between Six Nations and New York State settlers, right in that middle border area. And so this is what's interesting to me. So here we have what becomes Cortland County. Down here, it's the township of Homer, the township of Sullivan, and Cincinnatus and Virgil. And of course, the county of Cortland is a little bit bigger, so it took some land from Fabius and Tully townships. Onondaga County, when it was originally formed, most of this area was actually in Onondaga County because they kept breaking off counties to the west and making them smaller, smaller, and smaller. Onondaga County eventually ended up around this line here and up to this line there. So that, and actually a little bit more to the west over Skaneateles Lake over there. So that became Onondaga County. Cayuga County is very narrow, but it starts down here where Locke and Milton were Lansing ends, and goes all the way north to Sterling. And then west is Seneca County. On the bottom it becomes Schuyler and Tompkins County. So these are the counties that are currently in the area of the Central New York military tract. And this is just a little bit more of a close-up. You can see how it's laid out in an exact grid, starting with number 1 on the corner, working its way over to number 10, and so forth down to 100. It's the same in Homer, Solon, Virgil, and Cincinnatus. Some of the other places where the lakes are interfering, they have to make up the land a little bit differently, but they're essentially going for 600 acres in each plot. So they're doing all kinds of surveying tricks over there. And this actually, where Seneca Lake is, this was missurveyed. So there's the famous area that was on the other side of Seneca Lake that was originally included and shouldn't have been included, and it had to be changed, and there was actually a lot of title problems. And even throughout all this area, there were a lot of title problems. We'll talk about that in a moment. So this is the area that we're going to be focusing on. And so if you are a person who wants to do this kind of thing, so how do you start? And this is my process. This is where I began. I didn't have an ancestor that I was looking for that served in the Revolutionary War. I'm actually not from Cortland County, so I wouldn't even be looking for land records myself here because my family never lived here. So I'd be looking someplace else. But if you are, and you want to know what you do, and you want to verify, you can find out. You can look in a couple certain places, and basically the question is, did the service occur in the Continental Army or was it in a militia? And sometimes it was both, and sometimes it's very hard to tell because your family history becomes entrenched. Your tradition is this person received this land for this service and they did this. And when the truth comes and it wasn't quite that, it might be hard to break the tradition and just try to disbelieve the evidence and want to look, and you end up needing to look for the correct evidence, which never exists. But if you were a descendant of somebody who was in the militia, you didn't receive land. It was only the New York Continental Army, the 4 regiments. Those are the only people that were eligible for land in this particular area. Some of the other people were eligible for land in other places. They gave land in New York State. If you think about how we had the western frontier, back on the eastern end, there was some grants, especially in the time before 1775, when the British were active. They were giving grants down south or along like Delaware County, Susquehanna River area, and up north, everywhere from like Herkimer County and those areas around the mountains. There weren't really a lot of good land in the mountains, and originally this New York tract was scheduled to be given away up north where Clinton County, Essex County, and Franklin County is. So they call that the old military tract because they originally parceled that out and tried to give it away, but nobody would take it. And it wasn't so much that the farmers wouldn't move there, like the people who fought were reacting against it. It was more the land speculators. They didn't want to buy it to resell it. And so there's the key that we have here is how all this worked was land speculation. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But if you're looking for, you're pretty sure that your ancestor served, and you're looking and you want to tell me, say, Michael, I know my ancestor served, and I know that you didn't talk about him today, but I'm positive he did, and I want to tell you why. And you're going to give me evidence. I'm looking for these people because right now I'm stuck. I have a certain number and I can't find any more. And so my research is done, except for we know that research never really finishes. There's probably a couple more people that I've missed, and I'd like to know who they are. So you're going to look in the balloting book, and you're going to look for your ancestor. This book came out in 1825 in a published version, but actually existed handwritten. We'll take a look at something that came from the balloting book early, like when it was first handwritten in the 1790s. The index is really, really good. So the Tompkins County Library has a PDF online of the balloting book. It comes in 3 sections. You can download them and search them, and I'm sure libraries and historical societies have copies of the balloting books because it keeps getting reprinted because people use it. The index is modern, it's really good. I've only found a couple of errors, having worked with it for a couple of years. One of the big errors is our governor, George Clinton. He was a general. He was the Clinton in the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. He's not listed as having received land for his service, but he did. So in the actual book, you have to sort of look in several sources. So this balloting book is a compilation today of different original sources, and they stuck them together and published them, and it's a nice list. But even back then, back in the 1790s, 1800s, they didn't have access to this published book, so they actually published lists of who owned the patents, who should be living on this land. So if a sheriff in a local area had a problem with some sort of land dispute, they would know who actually should have been living there. They published it and distributed across the counties. But there were many, many disputes, and the reason why basically was, if you think about the Continental Army, it was supposed to be Continental Army was raised like in 1776. The Congress says we have to have so many regiments from each state based on how big you are. New York was allotted 4 regiments. They eventually did raise 4 regiments throughout the years, but that was 1776. The war went until 1783 was the Treaty of Paris, so you're talking about a 7-year service. Some of these men did serve over those course of those 7 years. Many of them were in and out based on their own personal circumstances or their need in the area, especially the militias. But when they went to collect on their land grant that they knew that they were going to be owed in 1783, 1784, there was talk about it. But at that time, the Onondagas and the Senecas and the Cayugas still owned their land. So New York State had to negotiate with those parts of the Six Nations to take their land, essentially. Yeah, well, that's what New York State calls it, right? So they negotiate. I mean, according to New York State at the time, they were making treaties. Yeah, we can laugh about it today because it became an illegal practice for states to do treaties with sovereign nations under the Constitution. But you're talking about under the Articles of Confederation, it was a gray area that New York State took advantage of and took the land essentially in different ways. Especially from the Oneidas, who are our allies, they end up taking that entire area where Verona and Chittenango, like that area, is that should be land that would have been the reservation if it would stay. But it was sold over the years according to different tactics. However, going back to this time, it was another 10 years or so into the middle of the 1790s when most people started settling. So if you think about that period of time, if you drew a patent in 1790, you had already been sitting on no pay for 7 years. And here's a piece of paper that says you can have some land. You live, because you're in the Continental Army in New York State, you live in settled New York State, probably someplace in the Hudson Valley or New York City or Long Island, someplace as far north as Albany or Saratoga perhaps, but you don't really live where you're going to be moving, so it's not like, oh hey, there's some land over there, let's go get it. It's so far away and you have no way of getting there except for walking basically, or taking some rivers that are navigable and then walking. And so you have a piece of paper that's worth something, 20 pounds. You sell it, you can sign it over, give it to a speculator for 20 pounds of New York currency at the time. The next year you have somebody say, hey, you're a soldier, did you get a patent? You're like, yeah, I have a patent, I'll sell it to you, and write it out again and sell it to him for 20 pounds or 50 pounds. And so some people sold them many, many times. And of course, some of the speculators created patents that were false because they knew that there was such essentially, basically counterfeit script is what this is. And so there was a lot of that, and there had to be a commissioner. Commission had to convene, and they wrote down their decisions, and that information is online. It's also sitting in Syracuse and in the Onondaga County records. So you can look up and see who was awarded the land. It's an award book. But basically that's what happened with the Continental Army. The militia, on the other hand, they didn't have any of this, except for a handful of people here and there. And I've heard of some people, especially online, people say, hey, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was in a militia and got some land. How did that work? I'm the expert, and I'm like, well, I don't know. We'll look it up, and so we'll see. And so it turns out that once in a while, somebody did something special in an area and was awarded extra land. But it was mostly on the eastern side of New York, but it was already settled, or close to that area, like Delaware County. So here we are, with the balloting book is a good resource for looking for names. If you look in the index, you can see names and look for versions of spellings. We'll come across one person who lived here in Cortland County and was a settler who had what is essentially a different name, but we'll see how it works out. And you can see that there's, what's the other version? Another person I found, Captain John Shepard, he said on his tract, and he's also not in the Book of Delivery. So I started looking at the Book of Delivery, who picked up the actual patent as a resource, because 165 or so soldiers picked up the patent themselves. A lot of the other ones were picked up by speculators that they had already purchased the land, or a lot of officers were involved, and they picked up the paper for their soldiers and just redistributed it, whatever. But essentially, this is basically the people who bought the land were the people who picked up the patents in 1790 in a lot of cases. John Albright, I started with him because when I was driving on Route 13, I saw that John Albright was a Revolutionary soldier. He settled in the area, and I was like, oh, that's cool. Let me see if he fits Professor Wright's circumstances. Did he serve in the Sullivan expedition and then settle? Because this would be cool to have the first one right close to where I live. And as it turns out, he did. And he was born in 1760, so when he joined the Army, he was still a teenager. He died in East Homer in 1845. He lived a nice long life. He was indentured or apprenticed to a tailor, and he took this to the tailor's son draft notice. So basically he traded his indenture for the draft notice. Went into the Army. He was at Fort Montgomery in eastern New York, Valley Forge, Fort Stanwix in Rome, where he was taken prisoner and taken to Canada and then later released. He served on the Sullivan campaign in 1779. He was at Yorktown when Cornwallis surrendered in 1781. As part of the New York regiments, you can trace his service and also where those regiments were at those times. This is verified history. It's amazing that this guy he was like everywhere. He was a corporal when he got out. He was eligible, corporals and privates were eligible for the 500 acres from New York plus the 100 acres from Congress. The 100 acres were generally given in an area of Ohio, and they could trade that piece of paper for 600 acres here. So that's why our lots were laid out in 600 acres, because that piece of paper with the federal land could be traded to New York State. New York State sold those. Or they could be kept and disposed of privately, and then you got 500 acres here, and the way the surveys go, you would see a chunk of land cut off. That would be the state's 100 acres. They also assessed a surveying fee of 50 acres, or I think it was 12 shillings, a certain amount of money for the surveyors, and if you didn't pay that within the 2 years, you lost your 50 acres, and it was always the best 50 acres. It was choice. So, John Albright is here in the index. You can also see a Jacob Albright. So if you're doing genealogy, you might be wondering if that's a brother or family, because they're the same last name and they served in the same sort of area at the same sort of time. He's not, in this particular instance, not related. But it's interesting to see like what happens to brothers and families as they do go through, because a lot of times you find them together in this index. And as you go through, this is another scan from the balloting book. It has John Albright and also Jacob there. It has the companies that they were in, and under township lot and acres, it tells what that person was receiving. In township number 19, for John Albright, number 19 is the township of Homer. Lot 29 was 600 acres, and it was in 1790, July 8th. You can see this is when it's 500, so this person chose to keep the 100 acres separate. Jacob Albright got 600 in number 20, which is Sullivan, but he didn't settle there on lot number 28, as it turns out. New York State law required at the time a separate accounting of military land, so they created this separate accounting. You can look through all of this transactions in the balloting book, and it sort of looks like this. It's handwritten, and if you go through on Familysearchorg, they have the scans of this, but if you were looking at the physical book, this is what you would see. It tells you the first 250 so images are the printed version of the balloting book, so the same PDF copy essentially as you would get from the Tompkins County Library download. You start getting to image 305, which is a list of awards of the underdog commissioners. That's what we were talking about, those disputes. You can see who ended up with that land. Through my genealogy contacts, I've seen a couple of disputes and looked and see how it was resolved, and it adds to their family histories. Then of course we were talking about the fraudulent reselling. There's a lot of competing claims. So the last 93 images or so are how this all worked out. For John Albright, the patentee, on May 1st, 1800, his claim was solidified and made official by the commission. He got 550 acres because out of his 600, he didn't have the shillings to pay for the 50, which was in the northwest corner, and that was sold to a man, Theodorus V.W. Graham. And you can see just below his name is there. And Theodorus bought land. He was a speculator. He bought land a lot, as it turns out. You can see certain people over and over and over. And as a matter of fact, I know it's a different county, but there's a book called I think it's called The Entrepreneurial Spirit of Auburn. It's by Professor Anderson, Scott Anderson at SUNY Cortland. It came out last year, but the first chapter is about the military tract and land speculation prices. So if you have an interest in learning about prices and how things were bought and resold and who bought a lot of land and who was all involved in that, it's a really interesting read, even though it's based on Auburn growing up. The beginnings are the same for all of us, because we are all in that central military tract. So I'd recommend that as a resource. I picked John Albright because I knew that he was a soldier from the back, that in the Book of Delivery he picked up the patent in person, so I started with that. And this other Albright, Jacob, didn't have it delivered. It was given to a Mr. Lawrence, who also was a person who bought a lot of land. John Lawrence, he bought 39 patents. I went through and counted how many times he appeared. According to Goodwin's Pioneer History of Cortland County, the Border Wars of New York, Albright, quote, accompanied by his wife on horseback, explored his military lab after determining to occupy it, returned to Charlestown down in, I guess, downstate New York almost now, and remained until spring of 1797. Then the next year, on the 12th of March, they reached Mr. Benedict's house in Truxton, where they remained until Mr. Albright could erect a small house on his lot. It was the most primitive character, being composed of logs covered with bark. And so like these old histories of certain counties are really great for stories. They're not always accurate, especially when you see 3 or 4 old histories that have competing stories. But my favorite story about John Albright is he became a farmer, even though he wasn't a farmer. He had an apprentice as a tailor, and like he learned how to be a farmer, cleared off his land, and one of his cows went wandering, and he had a bell on the cow. So he heard the bell off in the woods, and he went to get it. And apparently he had crossed either the Albright Creek or the Tiafanioga, depending on exactly, it doesn't say, but it did cross the river. And he crossed the river after it, and he stood next to a tree listening to see where it was. And as he stood there, a bear came down out of the tree. So according to one of the sources, it was getting nuts. So some big old walnut tree or something like that had a bear in it. So he shot the bear and killed it, which is great meat. Back then it was like having a cow to eat because it was huge. As he started to like recover from this, another bear popped down and scared him, and so he couldn't get a shot off at it because he couldn't reload. So he took a moment to reload, and another bear popped down and he shot it. And so as it turns out, 5 bears came out of this one tree at John Albright, and he killed several of them, and the rest of them got away. But that's the kind of story, to me, that's the kind of story that when you read these old histories, you see all kinds of stories like that. And they're fun, but I don't know if we can really corroborate it. I'd love to corroborate that. But I just want to know where the story came from. I can't, like the oldest one that goes back, if you go back, it just appears in one of these histories, and then everybody repeats it, writing it a little bit different, embellishing it a little bit differently. But imagine, in this time, he's coming with his wife, and they're going to clear out land, and they're staying at somebody's house until they could build the most crude of shacks to live in. It's just an incredible story about these settlers, but that's what everybody faced. This guy faced it after having been in the war for 7 years and trying to rebuild his life after that. So to me, it's when they talk about these settlers and how much, like how great men they were, and also with his wife, these families were amazing families to be able to do this. So as you go through, just remember that the word township in New York is not a municipal designation. We use township here only as a military plot. So the township of Homer is cut down into the town of Homer, and part of it's in like the town of Cortlandville and things like that. So we don't use township, but I know that in places like where Pennsylvania and Michigan, they use township. And so when you have family or people that are from out of state looking into township designations in New York, sometimes there's confusion. We also don't use hamlets as municipal places. Like probably today, a lot of what we call hamlets used to be places where there were the old post offices might be. So like in some corners, like Sweets Corners or Moore's Forks or someplace that there's a post office. Also not a town, so that you might have to look for records and try to figure out what town it really was in if you're searching for records. This is John Sullivan, General John Sullivan on the left, and this is a part of the route. This is a contemporaneous map made at the time by one of his surveyors. They came up the side of the lakes. Actually, the route came up through Watkins Glen, where it is now in this side of Seneca Lake over to the west. But when they came back, they went down both of these lakes on both sides. So you'll see trail markers And that's what originally, because I grew up at the top end of Cuba Lake up here, I saw these trail markers when I was in this area, and I'd be like, wow, what was this all about? I heard it was a genocide. Did they kill a lot of people? And so I started researching. For our purposes, to fulfill Professor Wright's quest to see who actually lived here, we have John Albright, which we talked about, a man named John Michael Frank, who's listed in the delivery book as Michael Franks. So when I looked into the Cortland County records, I didn't see a Michael Franks, but John Michael Frank, John M. Frank as he's listed, he picked up lot number 43 in Virgil, and John G. picked up Virgil lot number 21. They're the only 3 people who settled in Cortland County as it stands today on their own plots. A couple of other people that were on the Sullivan campaign, a couple of other people did settle on their own lots. Jeremiah Osborne picked up Sullivan lot 45 and lived there. Robert Smith, for at least a little bit, lived in Cincinnati on lot number 2. And then we have 2 that I sort of count, but I'm not really sure if I could count them officially. Thomas G., not related to John G. He was the quartermaster sergeant on the Sullivan expedition, and his papers are in Cornell. He picked up lot 2 in Cincinnati. Actually, one of these is wrong, but he picked up a lot in Cincinnati. But he died in 1796 before he could settle, because 1796 was right about the edge of the time when people started settling. His son, however, did settle, so that G family over there is from Thomas G. And then a man named Captain Benjamin Hicks, he owned 3 different places in the military tract because he was a captain. He got 1,800 acres. And his family owned lot number 36 in Cincinnati, which they probably didn't settle because I think he settled someplace else. But his family did own it all the way until he died, or until somebody died in 1845. They sold it both, part of it in 1845 and 1846. So looking at the land records, you can find his name. And they did sell it late, much after the war. However, I don't think he lived there. He probably lived someplace else, like in Locke. And this is in New Hampshire, in Durham, New Hampshire. This is John Sullivan's house. He was a regular person of land living in, he was a lawyer living in New Hampshire when the war in Boston started, and he secured some with some militiamen, secured some cannons, and he became a general for Lord Washington. He wasn't one of the favorite generals all the time because he was impertinent and he was headstrong, but he became the man who led the expedition through central New York. After this, he resigned not too long afterwards and became, I won't say a politician, but let's say a statesman in New Hampshire. He was a governor of New Hampshire for a while. He served in Congress. And this is his house, and he's buried behind the house. I've been to the house twice. Once Sharon and I drove up there, but it's a private home, and we haven't been able to go to his graveside, which I'd like to do, but I'd like to have permission as opposed to sneaking around the woods. But this, at least, well, you know, when you drive that car, it's like, I'd like to see the guy, but instead we get this, you know, and I'll respect the wishes of the family to stay on the street. And this is John Albright's headstone over in the cemetery in East Homer, and lot 29 is right on the edge of the original Homer lot, township lot plots, and you can see the Tappanogos there, and so he had that land, like I said, where the creek comes right down and crosses and goes into the river. That was his lot. He's actually buried on his land, which I think is nice for him, you know, having cleared the land and lived on it. He had daughters, and so the Albrights sort of, his name petered out right away because he only had daughters, but there are Albrights in the area, and whenever I hear their name, I always think about him. So his memory persists, even though his family didn't with his name. I don't know if his daughters' families are still in the area or not, but maybe somebody could tell me. And John M. Frank, this is a beautiful stone that's in the Virgil Cemetery on Church Street. I guess there used to be a church there. It's no longer there in the area, but if you go to that cemetery, there's a couple of amazing carvings. This stone's huge. But he has like a story. He came from Brunswick in Germany, and then he decided to fight for the revolution. And he lived, he was 81 when he died in 1830, so he lived a long time. And he's not buried on, I don't believe it's actually his plot. I believe his is just one south. So where the village established is just to the north of where his land was. It's close, but not quite there. I think his was more on the creek And the creek veers off south there. This is an example. I was shown this. Tabitha showed me this book, and this is a compilation of the Daughters of the Revolution put together a typescript book back, let's say 30, 40, no more than that, 80 years ago or something, like a long time ago. And it has information about these different people. But as we see here, John G is not listed. And so what happened was John G and Thomas G got conflated. So when you're looking at old records, even if they're printed, they're not always going to be correct. Like we talk about this as a teacher, we talk about this a lot with students looking at the internet, make sure you verify your sources. Same thing with printed books. If you can triangulate your sources, right, have 3 sources say the same thing. Personally, I'd like to have 2 say the same thing at the minimum. A lot of times I'm hanging on 1. So like in my genealogy, in my family tree, I have 1 source, and it's maybe not a good one, but that's all I have right now, so I leave it there for the moment. But I know that I haven't convinced myself that this is really true. And here's where the problem is. He had land in Cincinnatus, but here it says town of Cortlandville, and the cemetery unknown, the graves obliterated. And then some of the information seems to fit with, as it says here in pencil, somebody amended it and said, wait a minute, this Thomas G died in 1796 in Montgomery County, like to the eastern part of New York, the old part. And so some of this is conflated. So you have to check and you have to make sure. And John G's grave is not there. I think I have a picture of the G-Town Cemetery, where G Hill and, was it Sims Hill? What's the other hill? The 2 hill, Yeah, Sims Hill? Yeah, so the 2 hill roads come together. So G Hill Road like sort of wiggles around, and if you turn right, this is right going up the hill next to, it's right next to a huge dairy barn right next door to this. But it's a beautiful little area with the G family's graves, but there's no John G, because as it turned out, when he died, he went and lived with his grandson in Tioga County. He and his wife went down there and they passed away there, and they're buried down in Barton. So it wasn't that the gravestones obliterated, although many of these are unreadable because it hasn't been upkept the same way as other places, and maybe the stones were not as nice originally. But that's where this is on his lot, though. It's actually at the end of his lot of Dryden and Cortlandville. It's like right at the county line. So I used my going through this process to find some Brewster stuff, and I used Familysearch.org because they have the scans of the records. If you don't have the ability to go to Syracuse or looking at the county records all the time, they're right online. So that's what I use. It's free to register and use like that. And the first step that you do is you're looking for New York land records. So this is anywhere in the state that they have records for. It's not just during the Revolutionary time. You can see it dates back, going back to 1630, and some of the counties have more modern records. For Cortland County, you can go online. You can do a search for the county clerk and find some land records right there online through the county clerk's, not really their office, but the company that they have contracted to do it. And I learned that too. Some of the records are printed transcripts of old records, and some of them are actually just the actual new records. So the first step is that you find that, and you want to figure out what county you want to go to. For Cortland County before 1808, you're looking at Onondaga County, so that's where I found a lot of this information about these guys. All the counties are listed out. And when you click into Onondaga County, you end up looking at lists and lists and lists of deeds and grantors and grantees. The grantor is a seller, and if you use an index, you can find out if the person you're looking for sold the land. A grantee is a buyer. So when you say that we received land, this is probably where you're going to find your ancestors buying land, because if they weren't granted it, they bought it. They had to get it somehow if they own it. And so I was listening to a student talking about his family has lived in Cortland County for many generations, and so he just doesn't know how many. So I looked to see, I just looked at his last name and searched in Virgil, where the family lives. They first came here in 1850, so that's a pretty long time, but it's not dating back to the Revolutionary War. So people who are trying to establish what is exactly going on in their families can use these records to figure that stuff out. And it's interesting, you can see property transfers between family members, and when people died, who received the land and things like that. So here's the old books The award book is the one that has the commissioner's decisions on who got the land. There probably were some disputes that people are really unhappy about still 200 years later. The balloting book is the original, like I said, and I had showed you the scan from that, and then deed indexes and so forth. It's really interesting looking at the deeds. I was looking through some deeds, and I found some interesting things. I was looking through a grantor deed index, and I found Aaron Burr. Hamilton is huge now, right, with the Broadway show, and so I might have even been listening to Hamilton on my iPod, and it popped up Aaron Burr. I'm like, wait a minute, Aaron Burr? And then as it turns out, Aaron Burr was a land speculator. He was one of those guys who bought a lot of land. This particular 1797 transaction is in Cincinnatus. He bought lot 54 in 1797. He also, this is from the Cortland County website. You can see it's done in a little bit different of a printout. And he also had transferred in August 8, 1837, land transferred to Elizabeth Edwards from Aaron Burr. And Burr's great-grandfather, or grandfather, was Jonathan Edwards, so the Edwards family was related to him, so that might be an actual relative. Sinner at the hands of the angry God was his family. And so the Edwards names and the Burr names are tied up in the records a lot. You can see a lot of transfers between them. But he died, I went and checked this, he died in 1836, so he didn't actually personally transfer, this is his estate. And a lot of times the estate is noted. You'll see in these sort of lists, you'll see estate, or you'll see attorney transferring for a person, but it doesn't really note it there, so I wonder what was happening. If you're trying to figure out what the lot is, so if we go back to look at lot 54 in Cincinnatus, where is that? Who owns that land today? Aaron Burr owned this land, where is it? So I wanted to find out. So I'm looking at a map of Cortland County here from 1855. It actually has the lot numbers very faintly throughout. So you find an old map that has lot numbers on it, and you can actually figure out where that land is today if you're doing some detective work. So when we're looking down here, you can see how the township of Homer was split up into Scott and Preble. You have some of the towns, these towns down here were Cincinnatus, so Freetown, Cincinnatus, Willett, which was named after a soldier, and Marathon. So I'm looking through the numbers, and here it is in 54 is the edge of Marathon. There's the line, and here's the actual lot. And it is, if you know the roads, I don't really know this road, but this is Irish Hill Road, a little wiggle there. And this road is Carter Slocum Road. And so the Carter Slocum Road crosses through where that lot was. So the corner of Irish Hill and Carter Slocum is just north, it's just across the town line because of that wiggle. But when I matched it up on the actual map, that's where it is. So he bought this land and some other plots for 2,600 pounds of money. You can see Aaron Burr's here. You can see Cincinnatus, the township of Cincinnatus, and lot number 54. So that was where he originally, he bought it, and then this is where he was selling it to a person named Benjamin Walker of the City and State of New York, merchant, and Mary, his wife, and Aaron Burr of the same place. So Benjamin Walker bought it, and if there are still Walkers there today, then they've owned it ever since then. And if not, then somebody else has purchased it. I like these maps because they also have homesteads or home locations with names on them. And when I actually was looking for Brewsters, my Brewsters are in Clinton County. My whole life I've had people ask me, am I related to William Brewster, the Pilgrim? And I've always had to say I have no idea because I don't know anything about the Brewsters. As it turns out, the reason why, my father was born in Syracuse, I was born in Syracuse, his father was born someplace else, and I don't know where because he died before I was born, so I never heard from him where my grandfather's from, and my father never wanted to talk about his family because his father died when he was young and he was upset about it. And so, as it turns out, he was born in Beekmantown. I looked in his obituary. Beekmantown's up in Clinton County by Plattsburgh, and his mother was married to a man named Eugene Brewster, my great-grandfather, who died when my grandfather was not even 2 years old. So there was a huge break in the Brewster story because of these early deaths. And my great-grandmother remarried, and she had 5 kids that were Brewsters, and then 6 kids in her second family. And I knew some of those people, they're my cousins, but I'm not really close with that side of the family. And when she died when I was 10, I never heard stories from her either because I was too young. And she never actually talked about the Brewster side. So I didn't know what to do except for look into the records. So I went searching. And as I dug and dug and dug, one of the things I was like, you know what, if I look in the land records and the index for all the Brewsters, I can start to figure out which one of them I'm related to just by brute force. So I started copying down all the Brewsters, list and list and list, and I came across a name that I recognized, Sophia Brewster. In 1854, Sophia Brewster, who was married to an Oliver Brewster, she bought land, and it's in the town of Moores, up in Clinton County. It's lot number 93 of the old refugee tract, which was given to people who were Canadian patriots, I guess you would call them. People came from Canada to fight for the United States in the Revolutionary War. They were not able to go back to Canada because they were on the wrong side, so they were given land in Clinton County, and she bought part of one of those large lots, number 93. And then she actually sold it in 1864, so there was a question I had in my family, why did she sell it? And what's going on here? And why was it in her name and not Oliver's name and things like that? So as it turns out, I found some information I'll tell you in a second, but she sold it for a lot less than she bought it for. It bought for $500, 10 years later sold it for $150. And I'm not sure why, I have some speculation, but I did want to find out where it was. So lot number 93, you can see how close it is to Canada. The lots go 93, 94, 95 Canada, and 96, 97, 98, so we're in a number up and down as opposed to ours, which number all the way left, like we read and then start again. And if you look where it matches on the town of Moores, it's at this lot actually matches here. And on a later date, I found Oliver Brewster, a house, a little square, said Oliver Brewster next to it. I just didn't include that map, but then I looked on Google Maps, and there's a house still standing there that could have been built in the 1850s or maybe a little bit before, but that's the land that my ancestors used to own in lot number 93. So you can trace this kind of information and do this for yourself and find land and what's there now and things like that. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's frustrating, because I think to myself, what would my life be different if we still stayed in Clinton County? If we were North Country people instead of Central New York people, I probably would never have cared about Sullivan, so I wouldn't be presented here. So
Cheers.
yeah, exactly. A weird fact about to wrap up, a weird fact in the law that established the Central New York Military Tract, New York State said, we are going to reserve the right to all gold and silver mines that are found, because the state wanted to get rich. So as people have been digging all these years through all these lands, we found a lot of salt, right, and I guess a lot of limestone, crushed gravels, are really, no gold and silver still. So if you find any, don't tell the state, because I think this is still a statute that's probably legal.
Gold and silver.
Yeah. An article I wrote that has a lot of this information, I put a link to. It's on medium.com. I put a link to it on the Facebook for the Cortland County Historical Society. And if you have a question, or if you are convinced that you have a person who settled here from the war, and even though I said that it's probably not true, tell me. Email me, michael.brewster@cortland.edu, and I'll look it up, because that's what I do. So thank you for your time, and we'll hope to see you next time. Any questions from anybody? I'll put questions.
Yeah, you were talking about the, I'll call them the Shylocks, but I mean,
The speculators.
the speculators, did they represent themselves or other people, or a combination?
A little bit of both. Some of these men, like the ones that I had noted here, were actually the men who were the men with the money. There were a lot of agents for like conglomerates with money. Most of that happened a little bit west of here in the Phelps and Gorham Purchase and the Howland Land Company, and some of those were bigger companies with more agents and representatives. These were a lot of people just buying paper themselves in that post-war time, when money was not really worth a lot, and here's some land some miles away and it's worth something eventually. So, but mostly I think that a lot of these people did it themselves as opposed to agents. But there's some attorneys in there who I'm sure are working for people. Hi.
The balloting book is solely for New York State.
Yes.
So is there like, a lot of people from Rhode Island migrated. Is there a balloting book for Rhode Island?
I think, and especially some of those states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they went to like Ohio, so there's probably some sort of record. The state of Ohio has a really good website of what they call the Western Reserve and places like that. There were lands, the military lands that were given. They have a really good website of land records that I just happened to brush against a little bit because somebody asked me a question about Ohio. And so the information is there. So if you do a little bit digging online, you can find it pretty quickly. But from what I looked at originally, it looked like it was pretty complete, like our records are that I have been going through. And so I would imagine that it's similar, where you can find people who have moved to, especially if you know that they moved to Ohio, you can look in that state. Later, after the War of 1812 and some of the later wars, other states opened up. Michigan was a place where people got land grants from the War of 1812, and I think Arkansas, and Missouri, and Illinois, some of those places. So, especially from the War of 1812, there were cases as far as like 1855. There was a law that was passed by Congress opening up lands that widows especially got grants then. And they didn't move, they sold them usually, but maybe they gave them to some younger part of their family who moved west. So you can trace those. Oliver and Sophia moved to Michigan with two of their married daughters. And so in 1864, I don't know if Oliver is listed as a father, but I don't see that he actually lived there. He might have died then. But Sophia definitely went, and she lived until she was 75. She was alive in the 1880 census, living with one of her daughters. So she was a strong person. As it turns out, Oliver, I just found this out like last week, Oliver Brewster is one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history because it established extradition law. He was born in Canada. I showed you where that line was. The Brewsters came down from just across into what was then lower Canada, Quebec. They came from Vermont around the lake basically and then scooched down into New York. But he had been arrested for possessing stolen goods. And somebody went across the border and abducted him and brought him back to Vermont to be tried. His lawyer said, you can't do that. You can't cross the border to get him. That's an illegal extradition, or whatever they called it back then. And as it turns out, the judge in Vermont said, he had the stuff, and we don't care. And, if Canada has a problem, Canada can, raise that international law with the United States. We're going to try him. And he went to prison in 1835. He was in prison in Vermont, and then 1840 he's living in Vermont. 1850 he's living in New York. So he never lived back in Canada. So he must have had a problem. Maybe that's why she was buying the property, because he was, a convicted felon or something. I don't know, But I was looking up his name and I found it, and that's the first extradition case in Western law. Like even in Australia, they based cases on that particular Vermont state versus Brewster. So there's my, we don't like borders very much. I always wondered why we had problems with like boundaries and borders. Now I know. So. Other questions? Yes.
In the beginning, you referenced 6,000 served under Sullivan.
Around there, yeah.
Were those the only ones that were granted land in this military tract?
No, this military tract was open for any of the New York Continental soldiers. So there were plenty of people who never were served on the New York part of the Sullivan. And the Sullivan expedition actually had soldiers from New Hampshire, because Sullivan himself was from New Hampshire. Had soldiers, a small number from Pennsylvania, but a lot from New Jersey and Massachusetts and Connecticut. And then there were other New York soldiers who never came on the Sullivan expedition who did get land here. So I have a list of settlers and a list of, but like I said, my personal goal was to fulfill Wright's question about the Sullivan expedition. But I've come across many, and we have here in the area many people who didn't actually get land, but who were Revolutionary War soldiers who settled here. You can go to any local cemetery and see tons in the Homer Cemetery, and we walk through and we'll see. And I'm like, oh, there's a Revolutionary soldier, cool. I wonder his story is. I go home and look him up. Like John Ballard was one of them. He didn't fight for New York. He was from another state, or he was in the militia. I think he was from another state originally. So yeah, these ones, the tract, the entire big picture of the tract. People got land. They were people who served in any of the 4 regiments, not just in the Sullivan expedition, but they could have been people who were only at Fort Montgomery or in Stanwix, or went south with one of the campaigns or something like that. So it's not limited to the Sullivan expedition, but that was my angle into it in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you.